Hello. Before we get down to cinema, I would like to draw your attention to our Patreon. Regular listeners will know that these podcasts are supported by Quad, our home cinema in Derby, UK. But as Quad is a charity, we want to make Cinelit as self-sustainable as possible. So, to that end, we have set up a two-tier way in which you can support Cinelit. For our 35mm Cine fans, you'll get a bonus additional episode each month where we will be deep diving into an area of cinema that will be exclusive to Patreon subscribers for at least 6 months before it arrives like a late dinner guest on the regular feed. Plus, you get the episodes a week in advance of the main feed release. But if you want to support us and don't feel that pressing need to have the additional podcast each month, but still want that warm, satisfying feeling of being part of the Cinelit success story, then you can become an 8mm Cine fan, where you can donate and get our heartfelt thanks. Head over to the Patreon page and subscribe if you can. However, we know that times are hard at the moment, so please do not feel you need to subscribe if you are not able. We'll still be putting out new, free-to-listen-to episodes on a regular basis throughout the year. Now let's get back to your regular scheduled broadcast. Welcome to another meta-referencing episode of Cinelit. Today we are returning to the world of England Screaming, one of our most successful podcasts, and we are discussing the new book by Sean Hogan, Twilight's Last Screaming. I'm joined by regular Cinelit historian Daryl Buxton, whose expertise no doubt will be put to the test today. But rather than just myself and Daryl banging on about the book, we are joined by the author Sean Hogan as well. Hello, Sean.
Hello, very pleased to be here.
Yes, we're delighted to have you on. The first book came out in 2020, and we just started the podcast fairly early on. And then obviously the world went to hell in a handbasket. And it seemed like at one point in the middle of the year, all of my Facebook friends were unwrapping books of England Screaming and put it on their feeds. I couldn't avoid it for like a 2-week period where everyone I knew had that book.
Well, it was really gratifying because, you know, as you might expect, suddenly realizing that you're going to launch a book in the middle of a worldwide pandemic, you know, was a bit nerve-wracking. I just kind of thought, well, no one's going to know about this book. No one's going to read it. You know, there was a launch event planned for it, which got cancelled. And I just thought, well, I've finally written this book and now it's going to like die on its ass. So it was really gratifying that people actually found it.
I suppose it's one of those converse things where it's just like, yeah, but a lot of people have a lot of free time on their hands to sit and read something. So they probably read it quicker than maybe normally a book like this. Sometimes it gets released and it trickles through into the consciousness and people take the time to read it. It seemed like everyone read it immediately.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. And I guess, people obviously seem to like it, which again, you know, it was the first sort of proper book I'd written and I had no idea how it was going to be received. You know, it was just this odd thing that I'd always wanted to write and finally done. But I had no idea that people would respond as well as they did.
Yeah, no, when we covered it on our podcast fairly early doors, and we loved it. And obviously, we loved it on different levels. Daryl being the Uber film fan was reading it and getting all the references. I'm sat there with Google as my friend all the way through, and that was the same with the new book as well. Yeah, so we're big fans here. Obviously, we brought you up to Paris Cinema Film Festival to talk about the book as well. We enjoyed it a lot, and one of the things we were talking about is, well, where's it going to go next? I mean, we both read Three Mothers, One Father as well, and that kind of like hints towards what you were doing in the new book.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know that I would ever write any more. You know, when I finished the first two books, England Screaming was just kind of something whose time had come. I was like, right, I'm finally going to write this book that I've thought about for years. And the opportunity to write Three Mothers, One Father kind of came up almost by accident. And I thought, oh, well, that'll be a nice little companion piece. And I really had no particular plan at that point of writing anymore. And it was just basically when England Screaming took off, I suddenly thought, well, you know, there is room for another one, because when I'd originally thought about writing this kind of book back in the day, I'd first thought about doing American genre cinema just because a lot of that was so formative for me. when I first had the fantasy about writing this book, I kind of thought, well, I initially thought it would be America. But then when I sat down to do it, America just seemed too vast. There were too many films. And because I hadn't really got to grips with what I was doing yet, it suddenly seemed more achievable to start with England. So then having done that and kind of having taught myself how to write this kind of book, I suddenly thought, oh, well, if there's an audience for it, I can now do America. And I knew it was going to be a bigger book and it was going to be an epic and all this kind of thing. But I suddenly thought, all right, well, I'm finally going to do it. But at the same time, I wanted to sort of finish what I'd started. So it does kind of conclude the story that was started in England Screaming, just because I didn't want to sort of end up in a situation where I was just like dragging it out and just writing more and more without any real need or desire to. That isn't to say I won't do more, but I just wanted to make sure that I kind of reached a certain stopping point with this book, even though there could well be more.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, Daryl, you're a massive expert on film, way more than I'm sitting here with Google as my friend during this, and every time anyone's name's mentioned in full, I'm Googling that name because it's bound to be a reference. I'm Googling that name. Okay, I haven't seen that film, but I have seen that film, and so I've got a list now as long as my arm of films to watch.
Yeah. Well, Sean, how do you feel about that when you're sort of writing these things? Because you do take some deep dives every now and then. I mean, in England Screaming, you're covering some of the big hitter films, and in the new book, Twilights, we've got all of the sort of well-known slasher movies and a lot of big American cinema in there. But then you turn a page and you're talking about something like February or about Poor Pretty Eddie or something like that. Do you have the audience in mind? Do you have your readership in mind when you're doing that? And what's your sort of feeling and approach about all that, about whether or not you should take a deep dive every now and then?
I'm not really writing for an audience so much as, on the one hand, I do. Then the books are never intended to be a kind of best of necessarily. I do like to try and be representative and pick out things I think are important. So on the one hand, it's kind of a survey of the sort of breadth of genre cinema. But on the other hand, there are sometimes films crop up in there that I'm not necessarily a huge fan of and just kind of work as a piece of the puzzle.
I suppose it's what fits the narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And because that narrative often develops quite organically, I mean, there's a lot about these books that is quite unplanned. And now that I feel kind of more comfortable with what I'm doing, I increasingly found that kind of characters were wandering in that I had no idea they were ever going to turn up. Especially some of the little kind of cameo appearances along the way. These characters would just turn up and I was like, I had no idea they were going to wander into this story. I mean,
yeah. I love that. I love that. I mean, one of my favorite examples, what wasn't even a character, it was a situation. It's where you've got William Shatner's character from The Intruder, and he's not only do you have him working on a radio station, but he's working on WUSA, from another movie, from the Paul Newman movie. So yeah, I mean, how satisfying is it for you when these ideas and these links pop into your head? It must be so creatively satisfying for you, and as part of the process that you're going through.
Yeah, it can be like a real sort of eureka moment when you find something like that, because it almost feels like it's meant to be. It's like, of course, this character would meet that character, and it just feels so natural when that happens, when this is kind of spark. I mean, to go back to what I was saying a moment ago about this being unplanned, I remember when I was writing the Let's Scare Jessica to Death story, and I sort of knew that was one of the first pieces I wrote for it. And I kind of had the vague what the story was going to be in my head, but I had no idea that Warren Oates was going to show up in it. And so when he kind of like drove up the road, I was like, GTO from two.
Yeah, fantastic. That was one of my, all the way through the book, I was sort of putting the book down every now and then and sort of cheering every few pages because one of my favourites had turned. I wanted to ask you about the Let's Scare Jessica to Death chapter in some detail, actually, because there's a brilliant sort of conceit that you do in that, where at the start of every chapter, as readers will know, you sort of name the main character that it's going to be about, although you do then go off on tangents through the story. But you name the main character who's like your inspiration for the chapter. Then you name the actor that played them, and then you name the director of the film. And here, of course, you put directed by John Hancock. And I love the fact that during the course of this chapter, not only do we meet GTO and various other characters along the way, but you introduce Jessica into the world of Jaws 2, and it's not the Jaws 2 that we know and love and that we all went to see at the cinema in 1978. It's the Jaws 2 that John Hancock started out to make in a sort of morally and financially bankrupt Amity. And you set that portion of the story in this run-down, destroyed Amity that's John Hancock's Amity. So it connects with the fact that he directed Let's Scare Jessica to Death. And then in a later chapter, you even bring the name John Hancock back because, of course, it's part of that sort of familiar colloquial phrase, signing your John Hancock, signing your name, and you have that in the register at Psycho. So I'm reading this and thinking he's not just throwing this together.
Yeah, I mean, there are, there's part of the fun of it is kind of playing these little meta games, and that I remember that I was having a conversation with a friend of mine. And he was asking, because I was just sort of like in the very early stages of starting the new book, and we were talking about it. And it was literally in the course of the conversation to him, I was like, oh, haha, I could do Let's Go Jessica to Death and then incorporate the Jaws 2 that should have been into it. And I was like, yeah, I could actually do that. And so that just happened. It popped into my head very randomly. And I was like, oh, of course, yeah, I can do that.
Yeah. And another thing you're very good at in this particular chapter and several others is really getting inside the heads of the characters. And you're almost writing them, in some cases, better than the original authors did and the original script writers. And I think it's the case with Jessica. I think you really, really capture the voice of Travis Bickle as well when you do the chapter that's based around Taxi Driver and Eyes of Laura Mars. And again, it just seems miraculous to us that you suddenly become Paul Schrader for half an hour, And I mean, how much of a challenge is it for you when you're trying to get inside the head or recreate the voice of a familiar film character?
Well, I mean, it's very flattering that you say that. I mean, it is a challenge, but it's also one of the most fun things about doing it. I mean, obviously, when I'm sort of prepping these books, I'll sit down and have a list of films and I'll rewatch everything and take notes and note down pieces of dialogue and things like that. And it's like an act of ventriloquism. You're sort of inhabiting the films, trying to take on the voices of the characters. And it's something I really, really enjoy doing. And, having started out as a screenwriter, I'm sort of used to writing for characters and trying to give them their individual voices. But this is kind of the next step entirely. And it's, obviously it helps that you've got these things to refer back to. And so you're just trying to get an ear for how these characters would speak and reproduce it on the page. But yeah, I mean, it really is one of the most fun things to do. I mean, in this book, I suppose I kind of went a step further with the American Psycho chapter, and it wasn't just trying to ape a character; it was trying to ape an author. I wanted to write
the writing style,
of American Psycho. Yeah,
which again I think you do tremendously. You become Bateman and you become Bret Easton Ellis in the space of a few pages. It really does read. You could almost insert that chapter into American Psycho, I think. And I love the fact that you introduce Bateman's love of Brian De Palma into that as well, and which we're both big De Palma fans. And
yeah, I mean, it's sort of like American Psycho is a pretty meta book in the first place, so it's just kind of like piling meta upon meta.
Was it just speaking on that? Obviously, because initially these books are sort of like billed as like creating a shared universe for all your favorite movie characters kind of thing. But a lot of these characters are literary characters initially. You know, you think of it like obviously with Bateman and a lot of the Stephen King ones and things like The Omen, for instance. These are all characters that were originated in novels that are coming back to prose in some ways. Was there any thought that you think maybe some of these characters I shouldn't touch because they're not film? They're their own prose.
I'd never really worried about that. They're all feel like kind of fair game to me. I mean, you know, in David Thompson's book Suspects, which, you know, was the kind of provided the inspiration for me to start on these things in the first place, the same is true of them. There are a lot of characters in that book that are literary characters. Sure. You've got Philip Marlowe and you've Jack Torrance and all sorts of characters in that. So that never really bothered me. I try to generally just stick to what's in the films. I will occasionally go back to the books and pull out little tidbits that are useful, but I'll generally sort of stick with the movie versions rather than the book versions.
Yeah.
I suppose one example of that is of the reverse of that is when you do the chapter on R.J. Macready from The Thing, and reveal that in his younger life he was a character who's perhaps better known as a literary character than a film one. Although I think the story is, what's it called? Silent Snow, Secret Snow, is it? Yeah, that was filmed for Night Gallery, but on TV. But it's much better known as a short story. And there you are with R.J. Macready as this snow-loving kid. You know, you mentioned the Thompson novel Suspects, and of course, doing American cinema gives you the chance to do your own little mini version of that within Twilights. In that, I suppose you got to the point where you wanted to include, and the narrative progresses from way back. You go centuries back in this one, which we'll talk about. But of course, at some point, you get up to the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and I suppose you have two choices there. You either go down the Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff route and have mad scientists and weird monsters and things coming in. You go down the other way, and you seem to locate the heart of film horror in the 1940s as being in film noir, and it gives you the chance to introduce a lot of noir favourites. Do you feel that film noir actually hit the heart of horror rather better than conventional horror did in the 1940s?
Yeah, I think that's certainly true to an extent. I mean, there are a couple of things, really. Sort of like, on the one hand, a lot of earlier sort of Hollywood horror is kind of set in the same ersatz Europe that a lot of the Hammers are set in, which is kind of why in England Screaming, I didn't really go back into the Gothic Hammers that much. And it's the same thing here. It's like they're all set in this kind of weird European netherworld that doesn't really exist. So that was kind of one reason not to use them. But yeah, on the other hand, part of what I wanted to do in this book, which I think was true to an extent with England Screaming, but more so now, is I wanted to sort of look at the notion of kind of what horror is. And I've never been particularly interested in like limiting things within strictly generic parameters. So to me, it's sort of like, yeah, some of those noirs are as bleak and as, you know, terrifying, if not more so than certainly a lot of the horror films of that period. And that kind of continues all the way up into the modern day. You know, obviously a very important film sort of lurking throughout this book is the parallax view. Now, no one can tell me that the parallax view isn't, to some extent, a horror movie, because it is, because it posits this world where like they really are out to get you and there's no way you can get away, you know, and that to me is completely a horror film. It may not be a genre horror film, but it ties in. And I think the same is true with a lot of the noir stuff. You know, like something like Nightmare Alley again is a borderline horror movie.
Yeah, I guess when you bring this into the 70s, as you say, you've got the paranoid thriller of the 70s, which again probably hits horror better than conventional horror films. You know, 3 Days of the Condor is a better horror movie than Blackula or something. You know, and also in that early 70s period and moving through from the late 60s, I guess, with Easy Rider, you've got the road movie sort of thing, the long journey across America, and that feeds a lot into your book as well. I love the chapter where you sort of you cram together David Mann from Jewel and John Ryder from The Hitcher, you know, and you've got the ultimate hitchhiker and the ultimate hitcher picker upper, you know. It's remarkable that you sort of seem to identify something in their names, that they're both sort of everyman type names, you know, and again it's finding horror at the core of a genre that isn't necessarily Michael Myers slashing people up, you know. It's something a little bit different.
Yeah, and you know, finding linkages. I mean, I have no idea whether Duel was an influence on The Hitcher or not, but they certainly seem to sort of tap in to the same kind of ideas and the same kind of feelings about the kind of, you know, the roads and highways of America. So, you know, it's instances like that, you just think, of course I should bring those two together because they're kind of dealing with the same thing, and it would be interesting to just play them off against each other and see what happens.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the Bill Pullman character transcending those two movies, Last Seduction and
Lost Highway.
Lost Highway, thank you. God, brain's going. Last Highway. I just love that because obviously Lost Highway just links into that perfectly. You know, with the looping of the characters, and you just think, oh my God, why hasn't that been done before? And it's like, well, because no one's doing this kind of stuff, I guess.
Yeah. I think my favourite sort of obvious link in the book, and it's one that's so obvious, Sean, that you don't even address it on the page. You just sort of leave it lying there and let us discover it. But I'm sure this must have been intentional. You write about High Plains Drifter, and of course one thing you do there is reveal that the Clint Eastwood's character transforms decades later into Dirty Harry. But I think the genius thing about this is you mention that High Plains Drifter, the town in that movie that becomes hell, that Clint paints red and turns into hell, is called Largo. And you just drop that name on the page and you never really refer to it in any sort of context. But of course, we're all reading that thinking, that place name sounds familiar. You know, it's Mar-a-Lago, you know, which brings us on to my question, I guess. You know, and you can sort of comment on that Mar-a-Lago thing if you like. But I suppose the question I want to ask is this a book about Donald Trump? Or if it's not, how difficult was it to make it not?
Well, I mean, yeah, it kind of unavoidably is. But at the same time, you don't want to lay it on too thick. I mean, it was kind of you know, when Trump was elected, everyone immediately started making Greg Stilson jokes. And it was kind of too perfect not to do that. But at the same time, it's like, you know, when I started writing England Screaming, I didn't really know what kind of book it was going to be. And it eventually became clear to me that what I was doing was writing about the here and now, and I was writing about the current state of England and everything that was going on at the time. But it was very important to me never to mention Brexit or anything like that, because you don't want to tie a book too specifically to a time and place, and you don't want it to just be about that. But that was certainly what was informing it. So when it came to time to do this book, I was like, all right, well, I'm going to continue on in that vein. And so it seems almost too perfect not to use Stilson and obviously to use him in that way. But you don't ever want to lay it on too thick. Again, it was sort of like little resonances throw themselves up like the Lego thing. But it's enough that it's there. You don't ever just want to harp on it because, you know, you don't want to hit people over the head with this stuff. It's like, it's there if you want it. You don't have to take it. Hopefully the story works on its own anyway. But part of the point of these books is to sort of look at, you know, the state of the world and of these different countries through the lens of genre cinema, because so much of what genre cinema does is kind of tap into the zeitgeist and the sort of collective subconscious and all that kind of thing. And so you want to use them as a lens to look at this stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
But you just don't ever want to be too obvious about it, even though it's like, yeah, I mean, of course, Stilson represents the same sort of thing as Trump. He's not meant to be Trump, but he's meant to be symptomatic of the same kind of thing that produced Trump.
Yeah, I guess the key texts are things like, Orwell's Animal Farm in 1984 never go out of date, do they? Because he did the same. He didn't make specific references, and you're sort of following in that line. So these books will remain current. This sort of stuff, this sort of dystopian stuff and this sort of downbeat stuff, unfortunately, never does go out of date.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah.
I mean, just looking at the three pieces as a whole, I feel like you said the first book, it was you writing your way into discovering how to write a book. It definitely feels that by like Three Mothers, it was like the through thread of a story was much stronger in that one and in Twilight Streaming than it maybe was in England Screaming, as maybe it's just apocalyptic endings of the other two make it feel like that's the capper, isn't it? But it definitely feels like, okay, we're building it, we're building a building, and the stories, like, it felt much more like the stories were building on each other in Twilight / Screaming. Maybe not some of them, but most of them felt like, okay, there's a little bit there that I need to remember, and there's a little bit there that I need to remember, and then obviously some of the main characters. But you just felt like you definitely felt more like a novel. Was that a deliberate decision, or you've just written your way into that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose part of it is just kind of having a better grasp on what I'm doing now, and sort of sitting down. I wrote it the same way. I didn't, I had kind of certain points that I knew I was going to hit, but at the same time, I was watching films as I was writing it, and so sometimes a story would suggest itself, and it would just kind of cohere quite organically, and certain things would get thrown up without me knowing they were going to happen, and there were certain points that I knew I had to hit, but I didn't necessarily know how I was going to hit them. So they were written in much the same way. I mean, it's funny you say that, because I remember my publisher, Steve Shaw, when he read the Twilight's Last Screaming, he said exactly the opposite. At first he said he thought that it didn't seem it was as much of a coherent story, although it did gradually sort of come together. But that's kind of by design, I suppose, because this book, it kind of abandons the main story for a while and does sort of a potted history of America, and then gradually brings the main story back into focus.
Yeah.
But, maybe it's just, me getting more experienced at writing them and knowing exactly what I'm doing. I mean, the smaller books do tend to have more of a through line just because they're smaller and there's not as much room to sprawl. So that was kind of true of Three Mothers, and it's true to an extent of the next one that's coming as well. There's another little adjunct book coming in the next few months about Australian genre cinema.
Oh, wow.
Do you know, Sean? I was going to ask if you were going to cover Australia, because I've been thinking a lot about Australian links myself recently. I'm so pleased to hear that, and I'd actually got questions about that to ask you, which I now don't need to ask. So I'm really looking forward to that. Now you just mentioned Steve Shaw there of Black Shuck, and how much can you tell us about what happened with the book? Because PS were going to publish it, and then didn't, and Steve came in very late on and took it on. So are there things that you can't tell us about that, or can you give us the full story there about what happened?
I mean, I can give you the broad strokes. I don't want to sort of like tell tales out of school too much. Sure. And the publishers themselves of PS have actually now apologized to me for what happened and how it happened. But essentially, cut a long story short, the editor who commissioned Twilight's Last Screaming then basically handed it over to someone else, to another editor, to kind of see through the publication. I don't think the other editor understood it at all. And it was kind of left very till the last minute. No one apparently sort of read the book. I sort of handed it in last October, and I don't think anyone even looked at the book until like March. And then all of a sudden I get this panicked phone call saying, well, with the, we can't publish this book. There's problems with copyright and all this kind of thing. And, I spent an hour on the phone sort of saying, but everything you're saying about this book is true of the first book. And I was told that, no, this new book is much more expansive and you shouldn't publish it and all this kind of thing. And eventually I was kind of left saying, well, what are we talking about here? Are you asking me to look at certain chapters that you think are problematic or what? And essentially I was told, unless you get permissions for everything in the book, then we can't publish it.
Okay.
And I was like, well, that's impossible and it's never going to happen. And it's ludicrous that you're even asking me this now when the first book is still in print and it's been in print for 2 years and you're still selling it. So, but that was what I was told. And so I just kind of put the phone down and immediately rang up Steve Shaw and said, look, this has happened. Are you interested? And he was like, absolutely. What do we need to do to make it happen? And so, hats off to him. He took the book on with, no time to spare. It was originally obviously meant to launch at Chillicon, which happened a couple of weeks ago. Steve said, if you still want it to launch there, we can do that. And so we basically spent a very intensive couple of weeks sort of proofing it and typesetting it and everything and doing all the stuff that should have been done. And we got it there, and luckily, Graham Humphreys had delivered his cover artwork, but he owned the rights to it, so we could just use that. So it all worked out in the end. And, as I say, PS themselves have since apologized to me for what happened. Okay. I think they were given bad advice and they admit to that now. So we've kind of cleared the air there. But yeah, I mean, it was a very stressful, unpleasant situation, and yeah, nothing to do with what was actually in the book beyond
which
legal.
Is as I read the book, I thought, I mean, particularly that chapter on the intruder and Poor Pretty Eddie, which has got some. I mean, you're dealing with racist characters there for one thing, and you don't hold back either. And I read that and I thought, oh, I wonder if this was one of the causes of the problem, but it appears not. So
I thought people might think that, and so. Because as you say, it's a fairly incendiary chapter.
Yeah, can we go back to the early chapters of the book, Sean? Because the first 8 or 9 chapters cover early American history. You're sort of working through a period from, I suppose, roughly from the Pilgrims through to the early 1900s, the sort of Wild Bunch era. And now, what was it conscious on your part that you wanted to sort of tell the history of America in those early chapters through these movies? Or did it come the other way around? Did you say, well, let's look at the list of films that I want to do. I want to include The Witch, and I want to include the Blair Witch Project, and I want to include Ravenous. And which way around did it work for you? Was it history first, or was it the fact that you'd got this bunch of movies that were all set across this sort of 200 or 300 year period in the past?
It's sometimes a bit difficult to remember some of the specifics now, but I think as I can best recall, what happened was that I thought it might start with the High Plains Drifter chapter. I thought maybe that I was just going to do that and sort of use that as a kind of conduit from the past into the present. And I wrote that and I kind of thought, no, there's more here. I need to sort of go further back and actually talk about the country itself and how it was formed. And so then I started looking at kind of some of the stuff I could use. And, I always figured that The Witch would be in there somewhere, but then I started doing a deep dive into like horror westerns and kind of thought, well, the American West is such an important part of the kind of history of America, both the reality of it and the fictional representation of it, that I kind of thought, I really have to kind of like do a bit of a dive into this. And so I did my own little mini Western sequence. And it was kind of knowing that I had the space to do that, because I always knew that this was going to be a bigger book. So I kind of thought, all right, I can be a bit more expansive. I can stop for a bit of a kind of, history of the West in 5 easy genre movie steps, you know.
And I suppose because this is a sort of fantasy America that you're dealing with in your own terms, you can then, once you've introduced the Western, you can touch on the fantasy West of the spaghetti Western as well, and bring in these sort of non-American movies set in this sort of heightened version of America.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, that is, you know, using something like The Great Silence. I mean, that is a movie that does, as much as it wasn't shot in America, it does use specific moments in American history. So it is kind of tied to an identifiable history, even if the movie itself is a fantasy. So it was kind of interesting to use bits like that. And, you know, some the historical stuff that's referred to in that chapter is like actually happened, is true. You know, and then, but you were just weaving this sort of fantasy around it. It's kind of nice to use nuggets of reality along the way, but to sort of, then surround them with all this kind of like weird, far out stuff.
Yeah, and given what the character Loco gets away with in The Great Silence, it's wonderful that you give him his comeuppance at long.
Yeah, that was kind of satisfying. I have to say.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to ask about, but. So yeah, it's right about that early period there. I mean, as much as you say it's like it's your own little Western, it's kind of like, it definitely felt like it was like, okay, well, it's not just the people that are the problem with American politics or whatever, things like that. It's rooted right in the actual birth of the nation, of land built on blood and built on slaughtering American Native American Indians, and you know that really. When you're reading it initially, you're thinking, oh, is it going to tie in? And then as it seeps through, you think, okay, yeah, it's atmosphere. It's building that world, a different type of world from what we know of America. You know, it's the world of the book, fictional world. How much of a conscious decision was it to jump from that period into the 30s and then into the 60s and 70s? With those characters coming through, you see, like you got your Harry Callaghan character coming through, and this is the vampire character from the Western Curse,
Drake Roby from Curse of the Undead,
and the near dark characters and things like that. How much was it? Okay, well, these are the characters that are moving the story through. Was that a deliberate decision with those characters?
Yeah, I mean, that certainly started off with the High Plains Drifter chapter, because that was. You know, the way that character functions in the book is that he's kind of emblematic of a certain, you know, portrayal of Americanism and what that sort of sense of justice means. And, you know, and the sense that, you know, that you can solve things with a gun. And so bringing that character in the modern day was very deliberate in that sense, because it was like, look, this is where this stuff comes from and it's still with us now.
Yeah.
So that character was kind of, you know, very, very symbolic of that. And so with some of the other, when I decided to sort of continue along that road and sort of and do the kind of bit of a little history lesson, it's like, yeah, you know, there were sort of definitely other characters that you like, oh, well, okay, I can bring this stuff across, see how the seeds of what America is now lies back in those periods, in that history, talk about what America is, how it was created, you know, the notion of freedom in America, the American dream, all this kind of thing. It's, you know, yeah, you're sort of like looking at where all this stuff started and how it's been brought into the modern day.
Yeah. Was there any particular characters that you thought, okay, I'm going to redeem this character, or I'm like you just said about the character from brain, the character got his comeuppance.
The Great Silence, yeah.
Great Silence, yeah. Thank you. Sorry, brain, don't worry. That you're satisfying giving that character. I felt like the character from The Shining, the Shelley Duvall's character, that felt like a redemptive arc with that. It's like, oh, I want to take that character and give her something, because everything gets taken for her in that movie, and it feels like that was a goal.
It's that's absolutely the example I would have used with that character. I kind of wanted to. You know, some people criticize The Shining for being misogynistic. Certainly Stephen King has done. I don't necessarily feel that way. I think Kubrick's doing something very specific in that film. and all of the characters are kind of like archetypes to some degree. At the same time, I kind of thought, well, I want to sort of, retrieve that character a bit and make her a bit more dimensional, and give her a kind of slightly redemptive arc, especially when, because that chapter sort of plays off The Shining against The Lighthouse, which is, a film that certainly seems to have been influenced by The Shining to some degree, and is also very much about kind of toxic masculinity. You kind of think, well, if I'm going to, put Wendy in that world, I kind of want to sort of take her character beyond what she is in The Shining, which is kind of, a victim. And it's like, well, I'm not just going to do that all over again. I have to take her somewhere new. And so it's a case of like her finally working through those issues, and commenting on what the character is in The Shining, but then also taking it somewhere further.
Yeah,
I think even when you bring Jack Torrance back briefly, he's very much your own version of Jack that fits into your world. And again, I think you absolutely nail his voice. And but this is a sort of a Jack who isn't there. He's sort of inside Wendy's head. And again, it's bringing a character from fiction, from a book and a movie, but making him your own.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you kind of want to comment upon what's there, but at the same time, if you're not, taking the characters further or reinterpreting them, then there's not really any point in doing it. If it's just, if you're just replicating what's already in the films, there doesn't seem to me to be much point. It's like you've got to take it and twist it somehow and take it somewhere unexpected.
I guess that's kind of what elevates this above fan fiction. I mean, when people say, "Oh, this is book based," it's fan fiction. It's like it's so much not. It's so much not fan fiction.
This is about something.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not gonna deny that there is like some of that fun is definitely there in terms of playing with these characters. But there's hopefully a lot more going on in the book than just sort of fanishness, as much as
I mean, you even at one there are a couple of points. One in particular that I'll mention where you change rather than just take a movie and then sort of do the Sean Hogan thing about this is what happens next, or this is what happened before that. With Eyes of Laura Mars, you actually change the events that we see on screen in the film. You have the characters getting involved with Travis Bickle. They get in the back of Travis's cab, and Travis sort of falls for Laura the way that he falls for Sybil Shepherd in Taxi Driver. And then the outcome of that is surprisingly different to what we know from the movie. And how easy is it to do that? Because your model tends to be, as I say, to sort of either look at what happened before the movie or what happened afterwards in your own mind. And here's an example where you've actually changed the on-screen events.
I mean, sometimes I kind of feel as though I've got license to change things or reinterpret things or leave certain things out. It's especially when you're dealing with films that have a lot of sequels. I mean, because, there's so many franchises tie themselves up in ridiculous knots. And so sometimes you just want to go, I'm just going to use this film. I'm not going to worry about the rest of them, because that ties me in too much of a ridiculous mythology that doesn't make any sense anyway. So, I mean, I am a bit of a magpie in that sometimes I'll just use certain films or certain characters and play around with them, Again, there's like the whole Laura Mars thing. I had no idea that she was going to turn up in the book, and then it just kind of happened. And so I just sort of went with it and thought, well, this is only going to go one way, and it kind of needs to go the full hog now, the way that it didn't go in Taxi Driver, but we need to see that where Travis is ultimately going to go. And so that just kind of happened without it really being properly planned.
Yeah, yeah. Your use of Reno Miller from Driller Killer is hey, that rhymes. Yeah, but the way you use Reno, you could easily have done a couple of chapters on him because he's a fascinating figure, and yet you just drop him in every now and then as like the patsy, the name that Parallax use to sort of explain away all of the sort of bigger events that are going on. How difficult was it not to sort of keep Reno as a sort of background figure? He might not even be real in your book, you know, he might just be this invented name that Parallax have created. How tough was it not to write a chapter about Reno?
Yeah, I mean that's the kind of thing. It's sort of like, well, if I did that with everyone, then the book would never end. You know, it was kind of nice the way he kind of kept popping up, but yet was never a full character in the book. And I like that. I think it gives the book a certain texture when you're just getting these names that pop up every now and then, but they're not. It just gives you a sense of a bigger world. I mean, yeah, there's so many films I could have included and wanted to include, and either just couldn't figure out what I wanted to do with them exactly, or just after a certain point thought I don't have the space. You know, I can't keep making this book longer and longer.
Yeah, the book we've got flows beautifully, and I think it's yeah, you picked on all the right movies. One thing I love is when you sort of go to extremes and you throw in a movie or you put characters in a situation that even in this world, and even having read Three Mothers, One Father and England Screaming, you take us to a few unexpected places here, like introducing characters like the creature from the Black Lagoon, or where you reintroduce Johnny Depp's character from The Ninth Gate, and you have him and his new rescuer, who I won't name, ending up involved in the action of a particular movie, which we certainly wouldn't have expected at the start of the chapter. So again, how satisfying was it for you to sort of take that extra couple of steps and say, are the readers going to buy this or not? You know, are they going to accept that suddenly one of my characters has met the creature from the Black Lagoon?
Yeah, I mean, again, it was we spoke before about not really dealing so much with the kind of universal monsters and that kind of thing, but obviously, Creature from the Black Lagoon was one that could conceivably fit into the framework of the book, and so he was kind of floating around for a while, and I was sort of thought I don't quite know what to do with it, and then that idea just came to me, and I thought, oh yeah, of course, that's, you know, the creature's always been here, and he'll carry on being here after everything's gone.
Yeah, so he's like beyond America and outside America sort of thing. Yeah, very symbolic.
And has, you know, has certainly been affected by America, but will kind of outlast it.
Yeah.
And the idea for that chapter just hit me, and I have to say it's one of my favourite chapters in the book, and certainly other people that have read it have said that as well, because it has a slightly different feel to it.
Yes, it does. Yeah, yeah.
You know, so no, that was something I was very happy with. The Corso chapter, again, that was something that I just really enjoyed writing that piece in Three Mothers, One Father. And it suddenly occurred to me, I was like, oh, I could pick up with him and see what he's doing now. And because it's such a great through line to sort of deal with various films, that character, because he's a book dealer, it's like there are so many kind of cursed books in horror cinema that you can just plug him into any of these stories. It works. And so I kind of suddenly thought, oh, well, you know, that way I can you know deal with the Fulci movies, and I can put Corso in there, and it's, you know, we're delighted.
It also gives you the chance to bring Dick Miller's Walter Paisley as well, which has got to happen. Now you've based a couple of chapters, or certainly started off a couple of chapters based around Oz Perkins films, and so you obviously love Osgood Perkins and his stuff, and of course he's got his own connection to great American horror history through his dad, you know. But I wanted to ask about those two chapters because I think they're both fascinating. First of all, the one that develops into the sort of self-help group for possession victims, which I haven't actually got a question about that. I just wanted to say, Sean, you're a genius. I read that chapter and I thought, why has nobody ever thought of this before? This is brilliant. And I love the fact you bring in the Nora Benson character from God, what's the film? Possession of Joel Delaney, of course. Yeah, Shirley MacLaine, and I think she, Mrs. Benson, the way you use her, is the best example of you showing us what's happened to America in recent years. The way that the Republican Party has gradually sort of got inside the heads of not just gun-toting NRA fanatics from Texas and Alabama, but of ordinary people who might regard themselves as liberals. But suddenly there's Mrs. Benson, and she's played by Shirley MacLaine, who's like the ultimate liberal, and again, of course, connected with Parallax through her brother, and so you've got all this stuff going on. But it's great how she becomes the mouthpiece briefly in that chapter for the sort of MAGA generation, and yet she's a rational, everyday, ordinary person. She's been through this whole sort of possession thing with her family, of course, but other than that, she's a sort of fairly normal, down-to-earth person, would regard herself politically as a liberal, and here she is sort of banging on the table for Stilson.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the interesting things about that movie, which I would have liked to have included more of, but part of the point about that chapter is to sort of deal with this whole possession subgenre in kind of like one neat little ball. Hence you've got quite a lot of different movies being included there. But I think Possession of Joel Delaney is a really interesting movie and quite underrated. But one of the things it's very good on is class. Which is not always a subject that gets dealt with properly in American films or is not recognized as such. But I think if you look at her character in The Possession of Joel Delaney, she is sort of like on the face of it liberal, but you can see a lot of this sort of deep-seated racism lurking underneath.
I guess so, yeah.
And it's all the sort of polite face of, the things we dare not talk about. And you sort of think, well, given what happens to her and her family in that film, it probably wouldn't take much to turn her into that kind of Republican, a few decades down the line. And that, again, it just kind of goes back to sort of like looking at a film and extrapolating from it, sort of saying, well, where might these characters end up? And that seemed to me to make perfect sense, that she would, as an older woman, would become that kind of character and someone who might go, well, Greg Stilson's going to sort stuff out that needs sorting out,
Yeah, so it is an example of this, the old saying, you get more right wing as you get older, sort of thing. And here's proof of how that can happen.
Yeah, which is a cliche and certainly isn't always true. But I certainly think with that character, you can look at her in that film and go, well, 30, 40 years down the line, she might be quite a different kind of person. And you can see the seeds of it in the film, definitely.
Yeah. I mean, and also it's not so much about like just getting older, getting more right wing. It's like people are shaped by events, and you have severe events like that. if all you had was like a facade of liberalism at that point, after those events, that's getting thrown away, and you don't care anymore. And I think one of the big things about this last 10 years or so is that people stopping saying I shouldn't say things like that in public and just saying things in public. And I think that really comes across with that character, I think.
Great. Okay. Well, it's glad to hear it.
The other Oz Perkins film that you reference is I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House. And now me and Adam have both dabbled a bit in writing ourselves. We've both written movie scripts and done a few short stories. We're nowhere on your level, nowhere near your level, Sean, but don't worry about the competition. But you've obviously inspired a lot of writers with your work. In my own fiction, and for years and years, I've had this idea about doing a story about a story, where I wanted to write this thing where the story has a consciousness and it's aware that it's written and it's on the page, And then as it goes on, you get to page 2 and page 3, and it's loving its freedom and it's loving its life on the page. And then you get halfway through the story and it realizes the reader's getting near the end, and it starts panicking, and it starts sort of, keep reading, go back to page 17, keep reading, I don't want to die, I don't want to end. And I've never been able to actually put that down on paper and nail it and get it started in a way that I would want to. And here in this chapter on I Am the Pretty Thing, you introduce the Stephen King character from 1408 and other characters that you introduce, and you absolutely nail this thing that I've been struggling with for years. It's slightly different. It's not quite the same as my idea, but it's this concept that halfway through the story, the characters realize they're in a story. They realize they're not real. Why did you write that? And because to me, it doesn't seem to quite fit. It's wonderful in itself, but it doesn't seem to quite fit the narrative and fit in with the sense of Twilight's being a novel. It seems a piece on its own.
Well, I am a big fan of Oz Perkins, so I wanted to include him in the book, definitely. And I think, I had the idea fairly early on for the February chapter and the sort of possession support group and all that kind of thing. So I knew that was going to be in there. And then I just started thinking about I Am the Pretty Thing. And I was like, well, people might question why I've put this in here. But it's such an interesting, enigmatic film that is Marmite for a lot of people. I know a lot of people don't like it, but I kind of felt compelled to give it its due because I just find it so fascinating. And I think I just almost started writing that chapter to find out what I was going to write about it, because I don't think I was entirely sure what I was going to write about it. And I'm pretty sure that I didn't even know who was writing the chapter until I got a ways into it. And I was like, oh, of course, it has to be, it's this guy and he's going to become. And then I was like, oh, of course, it's about stories. The whole chapter is about stories. And I suppose in that sense, that's why it's in there.
Yeah,
because it's kind of another layer of meta in this book that's constructed of stories about storytelling and all this kind of thing. I mean, obviously not every chapter connects to the larger whole, but I hope I hope they all kind of earn their keep, both in terms of just like a story and offering sort of different perspectives on the breadth of American genre cinema and all this kind of thing.
Now we've not talked yet about the big connection, though. We've not talked about the connection to England Screaming and the thread throughout this new book involving Damien Thorne's return and his nemesis John Mauler. So once you'd made the decision to cover American cinema, you clearly couldn't let go of these characters. We had to find out what happened to them from the cliffhanger at the end of England Screaming, but you find a way to thread them through this narrative as well. So there's sort of English interlopers sort of thing in this vast American saga.
Yeah, I mean, with Damien, that was kind of an easy thing to do because he's sort of a transatlantic character anyway, and he's not tied to any specific nationality, and that character stands for so much of the kind of contemporary ills that the books are about. Both in terms of politics and corporatism and all this kind of thing. So it was obvious that he had to continue because you can just plug him into America and he still works, and the character's background is there with the Thorne as a company and all this kind of thing. So that was fine. With Mauler, obviously, yes, that's much more of an English character, but because I'd sort of built him up as the opponent in the first book, I knew that sort of showdown at the end of the first book would have to be resolved to some degree, but it was sort of like, well, at the same time, I don't think Mauler's quite done yet. And so it was, I knew that, he would be back. I just kind of had to figure out exactly how that was all going to resolve itself. And, without getting too heavily into spoilers, the sort of place that the book is in, that is left at the end, I didn't want Mauler to ever be a hero either. I think he's a fascinating character, and there are, I think, as is clear in the first book, there's stuff that he says and believes that I can identify with, but at the same time, he's still a monster.
Yeah.
And so the fact that he might be, a kind of a corrective to what Damien the Thorn represents doesn't mean that he's not a monster. And so I never wanted to lose sight of that either. And I just kind of found them sort of two fascinating characters to write about. So they couldn't quite go away.
I think one of the other things, and we talked about like some of the things that loom large in this movie, like Stephen King looms large in horror cinema anyway, full stop, in American horror cinema and literature. The man's stupidly prolific, so there's no reason why not. Was there any thought on your part when you're thinking, well, I can't use that character, I can't use this character because I've already got 15 Stephen King characters in this book. It's like I'm just writing a best of Stephen King here. Did that ever cross your mind? Because it's like, obviously you got the Jack Torrance and Wendy Torrance, but equally Greg Stilson from the Dead Zone.
He's kind of unavoidable. Okay. I mean, I grew up loving King. I'm not going to deny that. I still read him now. He looms pretty large over American horror. Even though, a lot of the films that have been made from his work are terrible. Yeah. I mean, hopefully I picked out a few of the better ones. But he's written so many kind of iconic characters that you just find them popping up. And, even when you need a little throwaway character, he's often kind of written someone that does the job. So it's, so much of what American horror is, I think, is kind of down to him.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of inescapable, really. So I just sort of went with it, I mean,
yeah.
There's a lot of other stuff in there too. So, hopefully it's not kind of overbalanced, although, there's certainly a fair amount of King in there.
Yeah, no, as I say, it is kind of unavoidable, isn't it, really? It was just such a key player in horror for the last 50 years, so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's as much of an auteur as some of the other directors who are in there kind of a number of times. And I think you sort of have to kind of acknowledge that, really.
Yeah, maybe that's one of the reasons why we've not had that many great Stephen King films, because he is such an auteur in his own right.
Yeah.
Bringing in another auteur to try and direct that is kind of maybe clashing, maybe. Who knows?
Yeah.
So I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but it doesn't end well for the world. And obviously, as soon as you finish these books, you think, okay, well, when's the next one coming out? And you talked about doing a little adjunct for exploitation kind of smaller book. Are you going to go back to any of those areas to do a third book?
It's possible. It partly depends on how this book does. If there's, and still an appetite for it, if it does as well as the first one did, obviously the last minute change of publisher was a slight concern for me, and the hope that we'd be able to sort of get the book out there and get it publicized. But obviously doing stuff like this obviously helps. So thank you. So yeah, I mean, it's partly all right. Well, if the book does well enough to warrant more, but yeah, I've got ideas. I mean, I've certainly not ruled out the possibility of doing a kind of historical England screaming and going back and doing all the kind of gothic stuff that I didn't really do in the first book. A lot of people have said to me they'd love to see a more expansive Euro horror book rather than just the little one, which again is certainly possible.
Yeah, I mean, I really loved Three Mothers, One Father, but I kept thinking I would have even loved it even more if it was a big, massive, chunky book.
So you don't mind 600 pages of that?
I literally don't. I mean, because I love European horror stuff. So it was like, this is right on my street. Why isn't it 600 pages?
Yeah, at that time I had no idea that anyone would ever let me write more of these. So I kind of thought, well, I'll just do a little Euro horror one, and then I can at least say I've done it, But now I'm like, well, I could go back and do a big one, if I can just sort of.
The Oz one is right up our street. We love films like Patrick, and there I mean, without trying to anticipate anything, there's your John Mauler character right there, but yeah, I mean, Adam, I'm sure we can't wait for this, can we?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I'm already ready to put the order in.
All right, well, I hope you like that. It takes a slightly different approach in that it's almost like kind of an anthology story, and that it has a wraparound. It has sort of two characters binding the whole thing together with a number of individual stories along the way, but it takes a slightly different structure. So, I'd be interested to see what you both think of it when it's ready.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to reading about Donald Pleasance, I guess. Like that's like that character is worth.
Now, is that the Donald Pleasance of Waking Fright or the Donald Pleasance of Barry Mackenzie Holds His Own?
Well, Waking Fright, actually, Darryl. Well, I'm not against the Barry Mackenzie look at. It's fine. There's as much horror in that as any other film. So.
Well, it's true. I didn't dare go there. Put it that way.
Cool. Okay, so Twilight Screaming is out now.
It is. Yeah, it's available to order direct from the publisher or from Amazon or Waterstones or wherever you choose to purchase your books from.
Fantastic. So go out there and order it. And while you're at it, order England Screaming and Three Mothers, One Father. Why not? They're all available, so go for it. Thank you so much for joining us, Sean. Hopefully we'll try and get you back up to Paris Cinema later on in the year when we can do a proper Q&A in front of an audience and
I'd love to
talk about the new one. Yeah, it's cool. Good stuff. Right. Thank you, Darryl. Thank you, John. Take care, everyone, and we will see you soon.